It is the middle of the night in America as we go to air after another violent, troubling and dramatic day tearing at the fabric of US society. In fact, as we speak, the situation in New York looks horrific, with at least 2 police officers run down in separate incidents by vehicles in Buffalo and in New York City. Let's tonight look at some of the events, put some context around them and consider the options confronting politicians and law enforcement officials. I want to start with George Floyd's brother, Terence, who made a brave, respectful and inspirational visit to the very place his brother was so cruelly killed.
Peace on the left! Just on the right! Peace on the left! Just on the right! Peace on the left! Just on the right! That's what I'm talking about. I understand y'all upset. But like it was already said, I doubt y'all half as upset as I am.
Come on now. Speak.
So if I'm not over here wilding out, if I'm not over here blowing up stuff,
Come on.
if I'm not over here messing up my community,
Come on.
then what are y'all doing? What are y'all doing? Y'all doing nothing. Because that's not going to bring my brother back at all.
Now, there's a man plucked from obscurity, thrown into a global spotlight because of horrible circumstances beyond his control, but he showed poise, good sense and charity. Not long after that, the man who leads the nation spoke at the White House. Donald Trump has tweeted too much and not provided enough leadership during this crisis. So rather than show you little snippets that you get on the news, usually spun relentlessly against him, I want to show you a fair chunk of what the president had to say so you can make up your own minds.
All Americans were rightly sickened and revolted by the brutal death of George Floyd. My administration is fully committed that for George and his family, justice will be served. He will not have died in vain. But we cannot allow the righteous cries and peaceful protesters to be drowned out by an angry mob. The biggest victims of the rioting are peace-loving citizens in our poorest communities. And as their president, I will fight to keep them safe. I will fight to protect you. I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
This was important, condemning the killing of George Floyd, committing to justice and supporting peaceful protesters. Trump also walked to the church burned by protesters the previous night, drawing criticism for his efforts. Perhaps the criticism would have been stronger if he didn't go. We'll never know. But importantly, he pledged to restore order and protect citizens.
America needs creation, not destruction. Cooperation, not contempt. Security, not anarchy. Healing, not hatred. Justice, not chaos. This is our mission, and we will succeed. 100%, we will succeed. Our country always wins. That is why I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore security and safety in America. I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights.
This is the core of his message now, declaring he's taking control of the situation, but pointedly reaffirming the right of Americans to bear arms. Now, it's important to keep in mind he doesn't control the police forces or the National Guard. The president is demanding that city and state leaders across the country flood their streets with police in a show of force, and he's threatening little-used federal powers to deploy military units if they fail to do so. This is high risk, but apart from the obvious need to protect people and property, remember we're just 6 months away from the election, and Trump could hardly expect to win again if he doesn't assert control. No matter how ordinary his opponent is, The coronavirus has robbed Trump of a strong economy, so he can hardly afford to preside over widespread failures in law and order.
America is founded upon the rule of law. It is the foundation of our prosperity, our freedom, and our very way of life. But where there is no law, there is no opportunity. Where there is no justice, there is no liberty. Where there is no safety, there is no future. We must never give in to anger or hatred. If malice or violence reigns, then none of us is free.
When the sun rises in the US overnight our time, America's future and Trump's fate rests largely in the hands of mayors and governors in cities and states facing mayhem. Most of those leaders are Democrats, but most of them face the same reality, that restoring and maintaining order and protecting their people is the primary duty on which they'll be judged. One expert who's watching this closely is former Australian Army officer David Kilcullen, a counterinsurgency specialist who's provided strategic advice to Australian, British, NATO and US Defence Forces. He joined me earlier from Colorado. David Kilcullen, thanks for joining us. The President today has spoken about unity, he's spoken about justice and law and order, but the response he's outlined is overall a military one, isn't it?
Yeah, and in fact, this is the first time that there's been talk of deploying the active duty US military as distinct from the National Guard since the LA riots in the mid-1990s, so almost 30 years ago. So it's a very big step, what's being talked about now.
Yeah, do you think it'll transpire, it'll come to pass? He's essentially using this as a threat, saying if the state governors and the city mayors don't organise their police to overwhelm the protesters or the anarchists or the militias, then he'll bring in the military. Do you think it will be necessary?
Well, nobody really knows yet. What we can say is that there are something like 67,000 National Guard troops deployed now. That's the largest that's ever occurred in the US. About half of the country, 23 states, have states of emergency or curfews in place. And of course, there was already a very significant military involvement in the COVID-19 response that was already happening. So if that fails to get a grip on what is now very, very widespread rioting, it is quite possible that we could see the use of regular US military troops on the streets of American cities.
Yeah, that would be a shocking thing to see. Exactly what is the President up against? The law enforcement agencies, the National Guard, the various city and state officials, what are they up against? Anyone who's seen the atrocious killing of George Floyd can see the injustice here. But why have protests led to vandalism, looting, violence and been so widespread across the country?
Well, there are a number of reasons. One is, of course, that 40 million Americans who were in jobs 10 weeks ago are now unemployed. And a significant proportion of those are members of the African American community, which had very low unemployment, in fact, historically low unemployment until quite recently, and has suddenly seen a very large number of people put out of work. One of those being George Floyd, who worked in a job in a nightclub, which he's unable to do because of social distancing and the COVID-19 lockdowns. And he, like a lot of other people, had been thrown out of a job by government direction. So that's one factor. I think another factor is this pent-up anger that is across all parts of the community in the United States right now. There are anti-lockdown protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters. There have been protests in favour of the Second Amendment, the largest Second Amendment protest ever seen in Virginia in January. And there's a whole series of other issues. And as I pointed out in my piece in The Australian on the weekend, a lot of the cleavages that affect American society, urban, rural, racial, class, the interior of the country against the coasts, Democrats versus Republicans, all these things are coming under pressure because of the the virus, and things were sort of primed to explode, and it could have been anything, but it just happened to be this.
That's an important factor to recall in all of this. It doesn't diminish the challenge ahead, but the context is the history of these sorts of events in the US. You mentioned the 1992 LA riots when Rodney King was set upon by LA police. Of course, there are a lot of riots associated with the civil rights movement in the 60s. It goes back further, of course, and even more recently, of course, under Barack Obama, there were the riots that sprang up after another police killing of African-American man Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. But it seems much more intense and widespread this time so far.
It does. And as I again pointed out on the weekend, there is a view that it is in fact on both the left and the right of politics, and that we now have mass movements like the Black Lives Matter protests or the anti-lockdown protests. We also have militias with military-grade weapons on both the left and the right, and we have much smaller but more violent groups at a sort of higher level of intensity on all sides of politics. So there's now, if you like, all the ingredients in place. Now, if President Trump was to call in the military, the active duty US military, he would have to meet certain requirements in accordance with a thing called the Insurrection Act, which hasn't been invoked since the LA riots. And there would have to be a requirement for the protesters to be ordered to disperse and given a certain amount of time to do so. And if that didn't happen, for the military to respond. There's also a requirement to demonstrate that it's not just protests and it's not even just riots, but there's an active insurrection or an insurgency in place. And this is the reasoning, I think, behind the discussion of declaring the group Antifa as domestic terrorists, because that would actually give a predicate or a trigger to engage this kind of insurrection act.
As you've mentioned, there are well-organised and well-armed militia of all different political stripes. This is a deeply ingrained part of American history as well. Militia, of course, are named in the Second Amendment. The militia and the right to bear arms go hand in hand. There's a potential here for this to get out of control, even in a response to a military intervention.
Absolutely, and it's worth pointing out that there's a very long history of right-wing militias in the United States. In the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen rural libertarian militias taking on the federal government in Nevada and Oregon. But the really big change, I think, is since the 2009 Tea Party movement, where we've started to see, in response to that, left-wing militia groups, Redneck Revolt and the John Brown gun clubs are perhaps the best known, but there are at least 4 or 5 others. So it's about 360 right-wing or constitutionalist, as they call themselves, militia groups. There's probably about 50 all up on the left-wing side, so nowhere near as many. But of course, you don't necessarily need to have equal numbers on both sides. What you need to have is flashpoints where groups with weapons from differing political persuasions are within striking distance of each other. And there are a number of those places around the country.
As if what we've seen unfold already isn't terrifying enough, that sort of tensions, those sort of possibilities, those sort of flashpoints you outlined there are even more worrying and deeply troubling. So given all that, is Donald Trump doing the right thing in trying to really clamp down in an authoritarian imposition of law and order now, or are there any other options?
Well, I think the sort of posturing and grandstanding that the president has been doing in the last couple of days with the photo op in front of the church in Washington and the way he's been speaking in the Rose Garden actually underlines that he doesn't actually have a lot of power here, because this is happening at the state and city level. So it's mayors and state governors that are responsible for the moment, and it's city police, constabulary units, and then the National Guard. And the federal government has relatively little role. Even in the event of a domestic terrorism group appearing. It wouldn't normally be the role of the US military to deal with that. It would be something like the FBI. So the president is, let's say, out on a limb in terms of what his authority allows him to do, unless he's actually about to invoke the Insurrection Act, in which case he would be able to engage. But we should consider what might happen, for example, if the president were to deploy the US military to a state, but that state governor to reject or oppose that. And that's not at all impossible. Most of the areas where we've seen the most violent rioting, in fact, almost all of them, are Democratic Party governors and Democrat mayors, so the political party opposed to the president. So it's quite possible you might get a difference of opinion here between federal and state and even local government.
Extraordinarily difficult situation. David Kilcullen, thanks so much for sharing your insights.
Thanks for having me.